On a scorching summer day in the desert of northern Mesopotamia, in 53 BC, one of the richest men in the history of the Roman Republic rode toward his fate. The man was Marcus Licinius Crassus, and his ambition was as vast as his fortune. By sunset, his army would be shattered, his son dead, and his own life would end in one of the most infamous and symbolic deaths in ancient history. The legend would later say that molten gold was forced into his mouth, a final mockery of the greed that had driven him to destruction. Whether every detail of that act is literal or symbolic, the certainty of his brutal end is not debated. What happened at Carrhae changed the balance of power between Rome and the East forever. Crassus was not simply a general. He was a financial phenomenon. No Roman before him had transformed war, property seizures, and political chaos into personal wealth on such a massive scale. Following the civil wars of Sulla, Crassus bought the confiscated homes of executed rivals at absurdly low prices, and turned Rome into his personal marketplace of ruin. He built a private fire brigade that only extinguished burning buildings after their desperate owners sold the properties to him cheaply. While others chased glory on the battlefield, Crassus accumulated the kind of wealth that bent the Republic itself. Yet money alone was not enough. Rome did not worship gold. Rome worshipped victory, conquest, and the memory of bloodshed in its name. Crassus looked with envy at two men who possessed the glory he lacked: Pompey the Great, conqueror of pirates and kings, and Julius Caesar, whose campaigns in Gaul were already transforming him into a legend. Together, the three men formed what history would later call the First Triumvirate, an unofficial alliance that allowed each to dominate Roman politics. Pompey had military fame, Caesar had popular support and political genius, and Crassus had money. But in his mind, the imbalance was unbearable. He wanted more than riches. He wanted to be remembered as Rome's equal in conquest. The East became his obsession. Beyond Rome's eastern frontier stretched the vast territory of the Parthian Empire, ruled by Orodes Roman II and defended by one of the most lethal cavalry forces the ancient world had ever seen. Parthia was wealthy, powerful, and independent. To Crassus, it was both a prize and a challenge. He convinced himself that conquering Parthia would place him beside Alexander the Great in history. The Roman Senate did not authorize this war. Many considered it illegal and reckless. Tribunes tried to block his departure. One priest even cursed him publicly as he left the city. Crassus ignored all warnings. In 54 BC, he crossed into Syria with 7 legions, around 40 zeros, Zero men, along with cavalry and support troops. His son, Publius Crassus, rode with him, a talented young commander shaped by Caesar's wars in Gaul. The campaign began poorly. Crassus occupied a few Parthian cities, but withdrew for the winter rather than pressing deeper. That retreat allowed the Parthians to prepare their response. The following year, Crassus made a fatal decision. Instead of advancing along river routes with secure supply lines, he accepted guidance from a local Arab chieftain who promised a faster desert route to the Parthian heartland. Whether out of ignorance, overconfidence, or outright betrayal, Crassus led his army into open, waterless terrain where the Parthian cavalry could move freely. He believed Roman heavy infantry was unbeatable in any open fight. He was about to learn how wrong that belief was. Waiting for him was Shorna, one of the greatest cavalry commanders of the ancient world. Shorna did not meet Crassus with infantry. Instead, he deployed 2 terrifying weapons: heavily armored cataphracts armed with long lances and thousands of horse archers equipped with powerful composite bows. Unlike most archers, these men could fire accurately while retreating, advancing, or circling their enemy at speed. Near the city of Carrhae, the Parthians struck. The Roman legions formed into dense square formations to protect themselves from encirclement. It was a sound defensive tactic against infantry. It was a disaster against mobile archers. Wave after wave of Parthian cavalry rode in wide circles around the Roman squares, releasing endless storms of arrows. Shields splintered, Armor failed. Men collapsed screaming with shafts driven through limbs, faces, and throats. The Parthians had camels loaded with spare arrows, allowing them to maintain constant pressure without retreating to resupply. Crassus watched as his invincible legions were pinned in place, unable to strike back effectively against enemies who refused to fight face to face. Roman javelins fell short, cavalry charges failed to break the Parthian lines, the desert became a killing field. Desperate, Crassus ordered his son Publius to lead a counterattack with cavalry and light infantry. It was a trap. Publius charged boldly, driving the Parthians back at first, believing he had scattered them. In reality, he was being drawn farther and farther from the safety of the main Roman force. Once isolated, the Parthians turned on him from every direction. Horse archers rained arrows mercilessly. Cataphracts crashed into his thinning lines. Surrounded and wounded, Publius realized escape was impossible. Refusing capture, he ordered one of his officers to kill him. His head was severed and displayed on a spear before the Roman army. When Crassus saw his son's head raised by the enemy, something inside him collapsed. The army's morale died with Publius. The Parthians intensified their assault. Through the night and into the next day, Roman discipline disintegrated. Thousands were slain where they stood. Others fled blindly into the darkness, only to be hunted down by Parthian riders. Crassus attempted a retreat toward Carrhae under cover of night. The march was chaos. Units became separated. Wounded men were abandoned. Panic spread faster than commands. By morning, the survivors reached the city, but their position was hopeless. Shorna promptly surrounded Carrhae and cut off escape. At this point, the war was already lost, but Crassus still lived. The Parthians now shifted from destruction to negotiation. Shorna sent envoys offering talks. He knew that capturing Crassus alive would be worth more than slaughtering the remnants of his army. The Roman officers urged their commander to refuse. They feared treachery. The troops, however, exhausted and starving, forced his hand. Crassus agreed to meet Shorna under a flag of truce. The meeting took place on open ground between the two armies. Accounts differ on the precise details, but all agree on the outcome. A scuffle broke out during the negotiations, whether by accident or by design. Crassus was seized. Roman officers who tried to intervene were cut down. In the confusion, the richest man in Rome, the man who had dreamed of outshining Caesar and Pompey, was killed. What followed entered the realm of legend. Roman writers later claimed that Shorna ordered molten gold poured into Crassus's mouth, a final and brutal message that greed had brought him to his end. Some sources suggest the act was symbolic rather than literal, but its meaning was unmistakable. The man who had valued wealth above restraint died as a mockery of his own obsession. His head and right hand were severed and sent as trophies to the court of King Orodes. Crassus had not only lost a battle, he had annihilated an entire Roman army. More than 20 soldiers were killed. Another 10 were captured alive and deported eastward into distant Parthian territories, never to return. It was one of the worst defeats Rome had suffered since Cannae, and its psychological impact was enormous. For the first time, Rome had been decisively crushed by a power from the east using tactics the legions could not counter. Back in Rome, the death of Crassus shattered the delicate balance of the triumvirate. The alliance that had held Caesar and Pompey in uneasy cooperation collapsed overnight. Without Crassus's wealth to stabilize the arrangement, rivalry between the two survivors turned into open political war. Within a few years, Caesar would cross the Rubicon, and the Roman Republic would plunge into civil war. In this way, Crassus's failed ambition helped ignite the final crisis that destroyed the Republic itself. But none of that mattered on the day he died in the dust outside Carrhae. There, stripped of power, gold, and command, Crassus became simply another fallen general whose dream of conquest exceeded his understanding of war. His death was not merely a punishment for a reckless invasion. It became one of history's most enduring warnings about arrogance, greed, and the deadly limits of power. Crassus was dead, but the meaning of his death was still unfolding across two empires. His body never returned to Rome for burial. Instead, his severed head and right hand were carried east as trophies of Parthian supremacy. The message was unmistakable. The greatest capitalist of the Roman Republic, the man whose wealth had once equaled the state treasury itself, had been reduced to a political prop in the court of a foreign king. At the Parthian capital, where King Orodes was attending a royal celebration, the arrival of Crassus's head became part of a grim theatrical display. During a performance of a Greek tragedy, the actor playing the character of Pentheus was suddenly handed the real head of the Roman general to use as a stage prop. The audience reportedly erupted in applause. The humiliation was total. Rome's richest and most arrogant invader had become entertainment for the empire he had tried to dominate. This was not merely revenge. It was propaganda on a grand imperial scale. The symbolic importance of Crassus's death cannot be overstated. For the first time, Rome had not simply lost a battle. It had lost the illusion of invincibility. Until Carrhae, Roman power seemed unstoppable. Even catastrophic defeats like Cannae had been redeemed by eventual victory. But this was different. The legions had been annihilated by a form of warfare they did not understand and could not counter. Heavy infantry, the backbone of Roman dominance, had been rendered nearly helpless by mobile horse archers and armored cavalry. Tens of thousands of Roman families waited for news that never came. More than 10 legionaries had been captured alive by the Parthians and deported far beyond Mesopotamia into Central Asia. Ancient sources claim some of these prisoners were settled near the eastern frontier and forced into permanent military service against nomadic tribes. Their fate vanished into legend. A Roman army had effectively disappeared from history, swallowed by the vastness of the East. Back in Rome, confusion gave way to political shock. The Senate had never approved Crassus's invasion, yet now it had to confront the consequences. There was no triumphant general to blame, no surviving commander to court, marshal. The man responsible for the disaster lay dead in foreign hands. Rome had lost not only an army but 1/3 of the political structure that had stabilized its government for nearly a decade. Before Carrhae, power in Rome had been divided in 3 directions. One figure controlled the armies in the west, another possessed unmatched popularity and prestige, and the third commanded unrivaled financial power. With Crassus gone, the balance collapsed into a deadly duel. The remaining 2 men, Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great, were now free to become open enemies. Pompey remained in Italy, increasingly aligned with the conservative faction of the Senate. Caesar remained in Gaul with veteran legions loyal only to him. Without Crassus to fund compromise, bribe resistance, and smooth political fractures, distrust hardened into hostility. Within 4 years of Crassus's death, Caesar would cross the Rubicon River, launching the civil war that destroyed the Roman Republic forever. In this way, a battle fought in a desert thousands of miles away became one of the direct causes of Rome's transformation into an empire. Yet in Parthia, Crassus's death was not merely a military success. It was the defining moment that elevated Shauna into a national hero. He had destroyed a Roman army using speed, mobility, and psychological dominance. His victory strategy became legendary, and yet, as often happens in empires ruled by suspicion, his triumph planted the seeds of his destruction. Orodes soon grew fearful of Shauna's fame and influence. Within a short time after Carrhae, Shauna was executed by royal order. The victor of Rome died as a victim of his own king's insecurity. The Parthians, however, never forgot Carrhae. For generations, it stood as proof that Rome could be beaten. The loss haunted Roman military planners. During subsequent campaigns in the east, Roman commanders became obsessed with avoiding another Carrhae. They modified tactics, emphasized cavalry support, and built supply lines with fanatical caution. The specter of Crassus's annihilation hovered over every eastern expedition. Years later, Rome would seek revenge. Under the rule of Augustus, Roman diplomacy achieved what Crassus never could through war. In 20 BC, Parthia returned the captured standards of the legions lost at Carrhae without a major conflict. Augustus celebrated this as a great victory for Roman honor. The standards were paraded through Rome and placed in the temple of Mars' altar. But no number of symbolic recoveries could erase the memory of the defeat itself. Crassus's family paid dearly for his ambition. His son Publius was already dead on the battlefield. His remaining children lost both political influence and protection. Without Crassus's wealth anchoring their position, his descendants gradually faded from the heights of Roman power. The man who once financed half the Republic left behind no lasting political dynasty, only a story of catastrophe. The ruthlessness attributed to Crassus in life now defined his legacy in death. Later, Roman moralists transformed his end into an eternal lesson about greed. The image of molten gold forced into his throat became a metaphor taught to generations about the dangers of placing wealth above wisdom. Whether the gold was literally poured or merely used symbolically does not change why the story endured. Rome needed a moral explanation for a military disaster it could not otherwise accept. Crassus became the perfect cautionary example. But there is another side to his death, one that history often overlooks. Crassus was not alone in chasing glory. Many Roman leaders sought foreign wars to legitimize their political ambitions. What separated him was not motivation, but miscalculation. He underestimated the Parthians, misunderstood their tactics, ignored strategic geography, and placed blind trust in unreliable guides. His wealth may have blinded him, but his failure was also structural. Roman warfare was optimized for certain enemies and failed catastrophically against others. For Parthia, the victory created its own long-term dangers. Beating Rome once made future wars inevitable. For the next 2 centuries, Rome and Parthia would clash repeatedly across Armenia, Mesopotamia, and Syria. The frontier between East and West became one of history's most militarized borders. Carrhae was not the end of conflict. It was the beginning of a Cold War between 2 civilizations. In Roman popular memory, Crassus's death became a horror story told in every generation. Parents warned ambitious sons with his example. Senators whispered his name when debating Eastern wars. Writers portrayed him as both victim and villain. Even supporters of Caesar used Crassus's fate as political ammunition, arguing that unchecked ambition could lead even the mightiest citizen to annihilation. Yet from an analytical view, Crassus was not simply undone by greed. He was undone by a world that was changing faster than Rome understood. Warfare was becoming more complex. Cavalry warfare was evolving beyond anything Roman training manuals anticipated. Empires no longer rose solely by brute infantry force. Mobility, intelligence, and logistics were reshaping power on a continental scale. Crassus rode into a new military era with tactics from the old one, and history crushed him for it. The psychological impact of Carrhae on Roman soldiers was enormous. Veterans who survived carried the memory of arrow storms that never stopped. The sound of Parthian drums accompanying cavalry charges haunted Roman camps. New recruits were trained with Carrhae as a warning example of what happened when discipline broke and formation failed. The Roman obsession with formation tightened. Fear became part of doctrine. And yet, despite all this, the raw brutality of Crassus's death remained the element that history could never forget. His killing did not take place in the heat of open combat, like a fallen general struck down while rallying troops. It occurred in a moment meant for negotiation under a flag of truce when the illusion of safety still existed. Whether he was killed in the struggle or executed afterward, the betrayal compounded the shock. A man who ruled wealth died without dignity, stripped of command and ceremony alike. The legend of the molten gold endured because it captured everything the ancient world believed about divine justice. A man obsessed with wealth is fed wealth in death. A conqueror seeking endless expansion is consumed at the border of his own empire. A politician who bent laws to his ambition perished outside all legal protection. In the ancient imagination, this symmetry felt inevitable, even righteous. Yet the true horror of Crassus's end was not the gold or the beheading. It was the destruction he left behind. 20,000 dead Roman soldiers lay unburied in foreign sand. 10,000 vanished eastward into captivity. A political system collapsed into civil war. A frontier ignited into 2 centuries of bloodshed. His single failed decision reshaped the fate of the Mediterranean world. Crassus wanted a throne of glory equal to Caesar's. Instead, he became a monument to catastrophe. Long after the dust settled at Carrhae and Crassus's head had been carried east, the true consequences of the disaster began to unfold in slow, irreversible waves. Empires do not collapse in a single day, but they often change direction in a single moment. The annihilation of Crassus's army marked the moment when Rome's eastward expansion became cautious instead of confident. Fear, not ambition, began to guide Rome's steps beyond the Euphrates. One of the most haunting legacies of Carrhae was the fate of the captured Roman soldiers. Ancient sources agree that more than 10 zero legionaries were taken alive. These men were not ransomed. They were not swiftly executed. They were marched east across lands they had never seen, through deserts, mountains, and alien cities. Many died during the forced journey. Those who survived vanished into the machinery of the Parthian state. Some were settled on distant frontiers to serve as a buffer against nomadic raids. Others were absorbed into Parthian military units, their Roman discipline reshaped to serve a foreign empire. To Rome, these men became ghosts. Their families never received bodies, funerals, or certainty. They simply disappeared beyond the edge of the known world. The psychological wound this created inside Roman society was unlike anything since earlier disasters of the Republic. Defeat was one thing, erasure was another. Entire families carried the uncertainty of sons and husbands who had neither returned nor been confirmed dead. This uncertainty haunted Roman memory. Carrhae was not just a battlefield. It became a symbol of disappearance, of Roman power dissolving into the unknown East. At the state level, the Senate struggled to restore public confidence. Crassus's invasion had been unauthorized, yet the embarrassment belonged to the Republic as a whole. No public triumph could erase the image of Roman standards in Parthian hands. Military reforms quietly accelerated. Greater emphasis was placed on allied cavalry, skirmishers, and mobile warfare. The invincibility of the legion was no longer sacred. It had limits now, and everyone knew it. Politically, the failure removed a crucial stabilizing force from Rome's ruling elite. Without Crassus's wealth to lubricate compromise, grudges hardened into strategy. Pompey tightened his ties with the conservative Senate faction. Caesar, still campaigning in Gaul, became increasingly isolated from legal protection at home. His enemies moved against him with growing confidence. The Republic slid toward a confrontation that now seemed inevitable. In the east, Parthia rose in prestige as Rome's only true military equal. The victory at Carrhae was celebrated not just as a battlefield success, but as proof that Western expansion could be stopped. For Parthian identity, this mattered deeply. They were no longer just another Eastern kingdom resisting Rome. They were the empire that had humiliated Rome at the height of its power. This reputation would protect Parthia for generations. Roman armies would hesitate before engaging them directly in open desert warfare ever again. Yet victory also created internal danger for the Parthians. The success elevated Shurna to legendary status among soldiers and nobles alike. His name became inseparable from the humiliation of Rome. But empire politics rarely tolerate generals who grow too famous. Orodes soon grew uneasy with Shurna's popularity and influence. Within a short time after his triumph, Shurna was executed on royal orders. The man who had annihilated a Roman army met his own death not at enemy hands, but through the paranoia of his own king. Carrhae thus claimed two commanders, one Roman and one Parthian, reminding history that power devours its champions from both sides. As years passed, new generations encountered Crassus less as a politician and more as a moral warning. Roman historians shaped his story into a lesson about extremes: greed without restraint, ambition without preparation, confidence without understanding. His name joined a long tradition of tragic figures whose downfall became more famous than their achievements. In speeches, in schools, in private letters, Crassus became shorthand for what happens when wealth convinces a man that he cannot fail. But beneath the moral storytelling lay harsher truths. Crassus was not uniquely corrupt in seeking glory through war. Many Roman leaders did the same. What made his campaign exceptional was how completely it misread the enemy. The Parthians were not another eastern tribe that could be crushed by heavy infantry. They were masters of mobile warfare. They fought at distances Romans were not trained to control. Their logistics were built around speed and flexibility rather than fixed supply lines. Crassus marched into a military world entirely different from the one that had made Rome dominant. The lasting influence of Carrhae can be traced through every later Roman-Parthian confrontation. When later Roman generals campaigned in the east, they avoided open desert whenever possible. They hugged rivers, they fortified supply routes, they expanded cavalry forces. They feared another trap just like the one that had swallowed Crassus. Even when Rome eventually fought Parthia again, it did so with the shadow of Carrhae stretched across every battlefield. Decades later, one Roman commander would push deeper into Parthian lands than Crassus ever reached. Mark Antony attempted his own eastern campaign driven by personal ambition and political necessity. He too suffered setbacks, supply failures, and devastating losses. Though his army was not annihilated like Crassus's, the similarities were impossible to ignore. Once again, Rome learned that Parthia could not be subdued easily. Carrhae was not an accident. It was a pattern. Under Rome's first emperor, Augustus, policy shifted from reckless conquest to calculated diplomacy. Instead of launching another invasion, Augustus demanded the return of the captured Roman standards as a symbolic restoration of honor. When Parthia returned them in 20 BC, Rome celebrated as if it had won a war. Temples were dedicated, coins were minted, public inscriptions proclaimed the recovery as a triumph of Roman prestige, yet no one forgot how those standards had been lost in the first place. Augustus needed symbolism because military revenge carried risks Carrhae had proven to be enormous. The legend of molten gold evolved during these centuries as well. Roman writers emphasized it because it perfectly encoded their moral interpretation of Crassus. Whether the act happened exactly as described mattered less than what it communicated. The ancient world believed in visible justice. A man who worshipped gold died by gold. A man who used wealth to buy political outcomes lost all control over his own end. The story endured because it felt true at a deeper level even if details blurred. In later centuries, poets, moralists, and political thinkers used Crassus as a warning against plutocracy. Wealth without balance, they argued, corrodes judgment. Power purchased rather than earned breeds overconfidence. The Roman Republic itself had long tolerated massive inequality as long as noble ideals restrained its consequences. Crassus tested that tolerance to the limit. His death seemed to confirm that unbalanced power would ultimately destroy itself. Yet history is rarely that neat. Crassus was not simply punished for greed. He was destroyed by a combination of structural military mismatch, flawed intelligence, treacherous guidance, and catastrophic underestimation of an enemy's capabilities. These are not moral failures alone. They are strategic ones. In modern terms, Carrhae stands as one of the earliest recorded examples of asymmetric warfare shattering a conventionally superior force. For Roman soldiers, Carrhae lived on as trauma rather than theory. Veteran accounts described endless arrows that never stopped falling, shields growing so heavy with shafts that arms went numb, men collapsing from blood loss without ever seeing the enemy's face. Death came not with a visible opponent to strike back at, but from distant riders who never stopped moving. This kind of warfare broke the Roman psychological expectation of how battle worked. It replaced the controlled violence of formation, fighting with suffocating helplessness. The desert itself became a character in the story. Heat-exhausted men already bleeding from dozens of small wounds. Thirst weakened fighters faster than fear. Crassus had chosen this terrain in ignorance. The Parthians had chosen it with precision. At Carrhae, geography became a weapon as deadly as any arrow. Centuries later, Rome's eastern wars would eventually pass into legend as the great frontier struggle between East and West. But all those later conflicts traced their emotional starting point back to this one catastrophic moment. Carrhae established the boundary not just of geography, but of expectation. Rome learned that not every horizon it saw could be crossed at will. Crassus in life sought to place himself beside Pompey and Caesar as an equal conqueror. In death he surpassed both in infamy rather than glory. Pompey would later fall by assassination in Egypt. Caesar would be murdered in the Senate. Both deaths shook the world, yet neither carried the same symbolism as Crassus's end. Pompey and Caesar died at the center of power. Crassus died at the far edge of it, destroyed by enemies he barely understood. The tragedy of Crassus lies not only in how he died, but in how unnecessary the entire war had been. Rome was not under threat from Parthia in 53 BC. The campaign was not defensive. It was elective. It existed solely to satisfy ambition. That makes its consequences heavier. Tens of thousands of men died not to protect the Republic, but to decorate one man's name with conquest. And in the end, the only decoration his name received was molten gold in legend and eternal caution in history. By the time Rome finally transformed from a fragile republic into a centralized empire, the name Crassus no longer stirred ambition. It stirred restraint. Generations of Roman commanders studied maps of Mesopotamia and remembered what had happened when arrogance marched faster than intelligence. Carrhae became more than a battlefield. It became a warning etched into Roman strategic memory, a boundary between confidence and catastrophe. The Parthians, for their part, never forgot the moment either. Crassus's defeat did not lead to immediate Roman collapse, but it permanently altered how Parthia viewed its western enemy. Rome was no longer just a land, hungry republic of infantry legions. It was a rival superpower now proven to be vulnerable when its methods failed. This realization fueled Parthian resistance for nearly 2 centuries. Every Roman campaign in the East thereafter unfolded under the shadow of Parthian horse archery and the ghost of Carrhae. The recovery of the lost Roman standards decades later under Augustus did restore symbolic honor, but not total closure. The standards were sacred objects to Roman soldiers, representing the soul of their legions. Their return was framed as divine justice restored. Temples were raised, coins carried the imagery of recovered banners, yet no ceremony could erase how those standards had been taken. They had been seized from annihilated legions whose bones still lay scattered across foreign soil. Crassus himself, once one of the most powerful men alive, faded quickly from active political memory, but not from moral memory. Roman historians molded him into a figure of contrast. Against Caesar's brilliance and Pompey's fame, Crassus represented wealth without wisdom. His political achievements were overshadowed by his Eastern disaster. No great reforms bore his name. No enduring institutions carried his legacy. Even the Spartacus rebellion that he crushed earlier in his career became secondary to how he died rather than what he accomplished. And yet, history must judge him with more nuance than moral poetry allows. Crassus did not fail simply because he loved money. Many Roman generals sought war for personal gain. What destroyed him was not corruption, but miscalculation on a massive scale. He misunderstood terrain, he misjudged intelligence, he trusted an unreliable guide. Most fatally of all, he underestimated a civilization with radically different military doctrine. Crassus fought the Parthians as if they were just another Eastern infantry power. He expected his heavy legions to impose order through direct engagement. But the Parthians had abandoned the logic of fixed battle lines. They fought with motion, distance, endurance, and psychological pressure. By the time Crassus realized this, his army had already been transformed from a weapon of conquest into a static target. This is why Carrhae still appears in modern military studies. It stands as one of the earliest examples of highly mobile ranged warfare over heavily armored conventional forces. Long before modern mechanized warfare, the Parthians demonstrated how speed, logistics, and attrition could dismantle raw strength. Crassus did not lose because his men lacked courage. They lost because courage alone cannot defeat physics, geography, and operational intelligence. Even the famous molten gold legend serves more as moral compression than forensic detail. Ancient writers needed a visual metaphor that ordinary citizens could grasp. A greedy man dying by gold was a poetic ending that simplified complex reality into unforgettable symbolism. Whether literal or symbolic, the image survived because it matched Rome's emotional need for explanation. A disaster so severe had to mean something deeper than flawed tactics. Crassus's death reshaped the political chemistry of Rome almost instantly. Without his wealth to stabilize elite cooperation, the Republic lost its final shock absorber. Rivalries hardened. The Senate leaned more heavily on one military strongman to check another. The legal system became a weapon rather than a balance. Within 4 short years, Caesar would cross into Italy and civil war would erupt. The Republic that Crassus had helped dominate would not survive that war. Unlike Pompey and Caesar, whose names attached themselves to cities, dynasties, and titles, Crassus left only an absence. His death created political vacuum rather than continuity. His family did not inherit his influence. His wealth was absorbed, divided, and eventually forgotten. In Rome, memory favors what endures. Crassus did not endure. His failure did. From the Parthian perspective, Carrhae became proof that Eastern power could not only resist Rome but humiliate it. This belief strengthened Parthian confidence in every future negotiation and conflict. Rome would invade Parthian lands again, but never with the same recklessness. Every Eastern general afterward carried Carrhae like an unspoken warning in his campaign orders. The deeper tragedy of Crassus's war lies in how unnecessary it was. Rome was not under immediate threat. Parthia had not invaded Roman territory. The war was born from personal ambition rather than strategic necessity. Tens of thousands died because one man could not tolerate being less celebrated than his rivals. It is one of history's clearest demonstrations of how private pride can detonate public catastrophe. Crassus believed conquest would elevate him to equal standing with Rome's greatest men. Instead, it erased everything he had built. His riches meant nothing in the desert. His political allies vanished. His authority collapsed in a foreign land where Roman law had no power. He did not fall in the Senate like Caesar. He did not die as a defeated ruler like Pompey. He died as a captive whose ambitions had carried him outside all protection. The Roman world moved on, as it always does. New wars rose. New emperors ruled. New frontiers opened and closed. But Carrhae remained fixed in Roman consciousness as a scar that never fully healed. Every confrontation with Eastern powers, from Parthia to later Persian empires, carried the memory of Crassus with it. His failure became Rome's reference point for Eastern danger. Even today, more than 2,000 years later, Crassus survives in one form only, as a warning. His story teaches that wealth without restraint breeds blindness, that ambition without understanding invites destruction, and that no empire, however dominant, escapes the laws of strategy and geography. The molten gold image endured because it captured what history ultimately decided about him. Not that he was evil, not that he was foolish in everything he touched, but that he allowed one obsession to outweigh every other form of judgment. And in the ancient world, imbalance was the deadliest sin of all. Crassus sought to become immortal through conquest. Instead, he became immortal through catastrophe, and Rome, forced to confront its own vulnerability through his defeat, was never the same again.